Hey everyone, it's Friday, January 3rd. Let's talk PlayStation. So much like last week, there's still not a whole lot of news going on as we're going into the new year and people are going back to their jobs, so we'll have more news to talk about. But for this episode, there are two news stories that I want to talk about, some pretty big, notable, conversation-worthy ones, and one old news story that we're going to move on to right now, which is Gran Turismo 5 and the Resistance series. Their online servers are being shut down, so what that means is you're not going to be able to play these games online very soon. Resistance Fall of Man, Resistance 2, and Resistance 3 servers will be shut down March 28th, 2014, and then May 20th, the servers for Gran Turismo 5 are going down. Now, this is a little bit old news. We actually could have talked about this last week, but it wouldn't have made sense to talk about that, while I was also talking about my top 10 2013 games. But point being, it's here. We're going to talk about it now, and some noteworthy news. You know, these are some pretty popular PlayStation games, and now you can't play them online anymore. Now, of course, you can absolutely still play the single-player component of these games. You know, that makes sense, but the big controversy here is that Gran Turismo 5, for example, is being shut down, which is a pretty, you know, semi-recent game, 2010. I mean, it's not recent, but it's also a very popular game. Gran Turismo is a hugely successful franchise on PlayStation 3, and a lot of people are looking at this going, hey, you're going to shut down the servers for Gran Turismo 5? Is that because you want people to buy Gran Turismo 6? Which, by the way, if you didn't know, Gran Turismo 6 isn't selling that well. I mean, it's selling well, like, these are proud numbers, but if you're going to compare them to Gran Turismo 5's numbers, for example, it's not doing nearly as good. So people are thinking that maybe Sony's shutting down the servers sooner for Gran Turismo 5 to force people to buy Gran Turismo 6. Which, unfortunately, I could definitely believe something like that because, you know, they've got pressure to, you know, get good software sales to keep this franchise going. And Gran Turismo is extremely popular on PlayStation. I still don't know how this series is so gosh darn popular. People love Gran Turismo, and so I would have to imagine people are still playing GT5 online. I would have to imagine not many people are still playing Resistance 1, 2, or 3 online as much anymore. But, you know, those are still good. Those are still games that I'm sure they have some communities. But either way, it kind of blows. Me, at least, I loved playing the Resistance games online. I mean, I probably wasn't going to play them again anytime soon, but, you know, they're going to be offline. So if you want to play them again, you better get back on there and try it again real soon. And Gran Turismo fans, sucks, man. And also, if you are a trophy guy or gal like I am, then that's going to make some of these games impossible to platinum because Resistance 2 has online trophies. I believe Gran Turismo 5 has online trophies. So you'd be screwed basically once, so you better get on it if you're trying to get these platinums. And now on to our first major news story. Now, Sony filed a new patent, which, you know, they usually file a lot of patents, so no surprise there, but they filed this one back in 2012. Just recently in 2014 has now been published for everybody to go look at, and it's quite interesting. Basically, they're going to use cloud technology, kind of like with Gaikai, to kind of remix and add stuff to legacy PlayStation titles. Basically, the patent lists a lot of things off that we already know about, which is, you know, Sony's future goal with cloud technology and Gaikai, which is streaming legacy PlayStation titles to PlayStation hardware. So you've got a PS1 game on PS4, you've got a PS2 game on PS4, or you've got even a PlayStation 1 game on the computer, you know, PC. All that's listed in the patent, right? But what it's talking about is using save state suspending technology and sort of remixing and adding things to these games without drastically altering them or even hardly touching them at all. In fact, the patent kind of lists it as mini games and how the developer has it's very easy for the developer to go in and sort of add something to the game. Now, I'm assuming, since the developer doesn't have to put that much effort into actually adding content to the game, that it's not something crazy like actually coding and actually remaking this shit, you know, and actually like downloadable content. Like, it's not that. In fact, at least from how I'm reading it, it sounds a lot like NES Remix. Now, NES Remix is a new thing that Nintendo just did on Wii U, which is a downloadable title, and it's got old classics on there like Mario, Donkey Kong, and all that, but they're altered in a way that it's not like they went back and like really made new content. They just sort of touched it a little bit and tuned it up a little bit. Like, there's a Mario level that has it's completely dark now. They just put sort of a filter over it, or they flipped the world backwards, or they added new objectives to it, so it's like, you know, kind of like, not trophies, but if it were on PlayStation, if this idea came to fruition, they could add trophies to this, you know, to legacy PlayStation titles, which many Let's Talk PlayStations ago, Sony made a patent regarding exactly that, adding trophies to old PlayStation games. So it's very interesting. I mean, honestly, this whole patent in general, it's something that definitely could happen, but it's really, again, more of the same of what we've been seeing for how long now, which is legacy PlayStation titles being streamed to newer PlayStation hardware, or not even PlayStation hardware, computers, PCs, but Sony's just kind of broadening their aspect. Kind of, again, like I've said before, they'll put patents down just to secure these things, just to have it under their ownership, you know, just... It's usually what companies do, so who knows if we'll even see this, but I wouldn't be surprised if we did, because it's certainly, if it's what I think it is, it shouldn't be that hard to do. And now for our second and headlining news story of this episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. Macroaxis, which is this website that basically calculates a lot of business stuff. It's a really businessy website, to put it into layman's terms. Has a lot of information charting. This company uses a lot of certain algorithms and things like that to determine companies, corporations' like position, you know, in economics, and how much money they have, their assets, their liability, where they stand, and they sort of calculate the future of these businesses. And their calculation for Sony Corporation, and this isn't just SCEA or Sony Pictures, this is Sony Corporation, the entire company, they're listing a 78% chance of the company basically going into bankruptcy in the next 2 years, or at least in the next 2 years being in extreme financial distress. So I'll say that again. This website is determining, based on a number of different factors, they are basically saying that in the next 2 years there is a 78% chance that Sony would have to file for bankruptcy, or at the very least be in extreme financial distress. Now the website actually notes how they sort of operate, and how they at least list these sort of things, that they consider 90%. If a company were to be rated 90%, by the way, they consider 90% to be very likely of happening, because this is, of course, very alarming news for a lot of people who might not understand all this stuff and look at all the assets and things that Sony has, because Sony's been in financial distress for a very long time, very, very long time, since the 2000s, I believe, or no. They've been doing well in the 2000s. What years were they doing bad? Of course, the PS3 era and things like that's where it really started to make a downturn for them. But of course, mobile for them has been really bad. Sony Pictures has their ups and downs. Sony Music is, I guess, pretty good. I guess they lose money here and there. Sony Electronics is where they certainly lose a lot of their money, at least with TV and mobile. I know they certainly are hemorrhaging money there. But before we talk more about Sony, it's interesting to note Nintendo and Microsoft's rates on this website, which Nintendo has a 22% rate of going into bankruptcy in the next 2 years, and Microsoft has 1%. Now you're kind of wondering how that even equates, how are these, you know, determined, and why is Sony so high? So again, what this all comes down to is everything this company has, right? And you also have to look at, like, for example, a lot of people know it's pretty much fact that the Wii U is bombing hard. It's really not doing well, and a lot of people are like saying Nintendo's going to go under, or Nintendo is this, that, you know, Wii U's doing really, really bad, and people are so concerned about Nintendo, but in reality, Nintendo has a lot of money, and their rate of bankruptcy and all that is really quite low, which absolutely makes sense. Those numbers are certainly true for Nintendo, because they have a lot of money, and they could certainly take a lot of failures before they finally go under, you know? They're going to be around for a very long time, and they can make a lot of failures before they're gone. So why is Sony so high, and why is Microsoft so low? Microsoft also, a lot of money. They have a lot of money, and they have a lot of divisions. Now granted, they're not doing fantastic with like Windows Phone or their tablets or the Zune, you know, when that died, you know. So it all breaks down to a number of situations. One being, you know, a company, how much financial liability do they have? How much debt do they owe to other companies, short-term and long-term? And then you have to look at how much assets the company has in general, and how much revenue they're seeing from, or obligations from, other companies, you know? And then you sort of subtract that to see where they're at. Now, when you look at Nintendo, Nintendo only makes, like, video games. That's really the only business they're in. So any money they have, you know, it's in games. Like, that's just where they are right now. 3DS is doing well for them. Wii U's certainly doing bad, but they have enough money to take a lot of falls and a lot of failures. Now, you look at Microsoft, for example, and they don't have as much liability. In fact, they have a lot of assets because of all the software they tool out for people, and they're receiving a lot of payments from all these software and hardware makers, and they're really set in that respect. And they have, like I said, a lot of assets. Sony, on the other hand, it's very narrow for them. They have assets, but they also have a lot of liability. Some of the more accurate and recent numbers I could find is back in June 2012, Sony had around $166 billion in assets. And if you compare that to their liability back at that same time, it was $134 million. around there. So you've got their liability of what they owe and what they're going to be owing over time, over years, is 135 some odd billion dollars, and they have 166 billion dollars, which means that they don't have a whole lot of, you know, safe cash, you know, cash that they owe to people or cash that they're going to have to pay out. To put more of this into perspective, Microsoft's liability back then was around $50 billion. So Sony's got that much more liability than their competition. And it draws a thin line between how much money they have room for error, you know. Now you also got to look at Kaz Hirai. He stepped in as CEO of the entire company, and he really had to make a lot of changes. For example, one of his first moves was selling off the New York City building. That was back in early 2013. They sold that for about $1 billion. They were going to cut 10,000 jobs, and I believe they've done so, to save a couple $1 billion a year. Kaz had a lot of weight on his shoulders going into this position to try and save money on the company as a whole, you know, because they've been going down since. Their capital, their market capital in 2001, 2000, around there, was around $100 billion. And then their capital kept lowering and lowering ever since, and now it's down to like $11 billion. Their capital was from $100 billion to like around $10 billion in a 10-year span. So they've been on the decline for a very long time. And when you look at all of it, it really doesn't paint a good picture. You know, the revenues have been going down, or they've been losing money a lot of years, but even when revenue's up, you still got all this liability. And if you're not showing growth, you know, Wall Street and all this, the stock market and all that bullshit, right? They're not going to see growth, because that's what Wall Street likes to see. They want to see the potential future of a company. And if they don't see a future in it, then they're not gonna, you know, it's gonna do bad. I don't want to get too technical with all this, because this really gets into so much stuff. I mean, I don't work at Sony. I'm some guy living in New York, so I don't even, you know, even I can't grasp every single piece of information about this, but there's certainly enough there to understand why they've got such this high rate of possibly failing and going into bankruptcy. Now, it's also worth mentioning bankruptcy is not what you might think it is. If you don't know what bankruptcy is, it means that you're going to file for not being able to pay off all your debt. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go out of business and Sony Corporation is going to close. It just means that you're going to file into a certain way for the court to help you and to sort of understand what debts you can kind of shake off, or what debts you can kind of make peace with, or maybe try to solve it in a different manner to help the company bounce back up. That's, in, you know, for the most part, what Chapter 11 bankruptcy is. So that could happen to Sony in 2 years at a 78% chance. But again, this website, going by their algorithm, is saying that 90% is a much more sort of red area. Like, that might actually happen, whereas 78%, you know, it's certainly high, but it's not 90% from what they're saying. But I think one thing to take away from all this is, again, Sony's been financially bad for a very long time, and they're still around. The problem with all of this is, of course, Sony. They need to figure out why this is still happening, right? The PlayStation division, aside from PS3 and Vita not turning a profit, you know, it's been doing well for them. They're doing really great. Now going into PS4, they're doing really good right now. Granted, they take a loss on every PS4 sold, but they're certainly going to make that back. I'm quite sure of it. Because the platform's doing well. But there's other sections, other divisions of Sony that's doing really bad, and that's, I think, where Sony really needs to reevaluate what they're doing to try and fix where they're at right now. For example, why is Sony still in the TV business? Why are they still in the PC business? These are declining markets, and the TV business, for example, has had a lot of stiff competition, and Sony still makes premium products that don't need to sell for how much they're going. And mobile, for example, I mean, you know, they can enter mobile, but I mean, they're not selling any of these things, you know? They're not selling any Xperias. They're not Sony Ericsson, like, all this stuff, right? It's a huge problem. Sony's not the name that it used to be. When do you ever hear people raving about their new Sony phone that they got? Never. Now, while some people, me included, still enjoy Sony TVs, I'll tell you right now, I'll never pay the premium for a Sony TV. I get all my Sony TVs on eBay because I'm not gonna pay their premium. And clearly, a lot of people won't, because they're still doing bad, right? The TV competition's stiff. Mobile, they have no place in because they're not making a huge name for themselves, and they're not actually trying, and they're not marketing properly. And again, PC's been on the decline. Why haven't they just exited that already? There's a lot of things, there's a lot of divisions in Sony that just don't operate properly. You know, Sony Music, I think, is probably good for them, I would have to imagine. Like, Sony Entertainment as a whole, you know, it's kind of a hit or miss, right? Sometimes they'll have box office busts with Sony Pictures. I mean, that's sort of a, you know, the thing of it is they need to be standardized. There needs to be some sort of voice and direction for all of them that are going in one straight path and not different paths. I mean, I don't really know what else to say. You know, I gotta know my own place in this situation when, in regards to talking about all this. I'm not some higher up at Sony that's making these decisions. I'm not going to sit here and say what Sony should do, but for the most part, they should do certain things like standardize these companies, figure out what works and what doesn't work, and, you know, get your shit together, you know? I don't know, man. The only thing I can say is, I mean, Sony, I don't think Sony will go away in the next 2 years. I mean, I think that's pretty much guaranteed because, again, they've been on a downward spiral for a very long time, and they are making some positive changes. Kaz Hirai is doing some right things with the company there. He's trying to get them in a steady, steadfast approach. In fact, when he took the role of president and CEO, the company did finally start to turn a profit again. So they're obviously going in some right direction. If anything, it just shows, like, you know, you've got a problem, you got to fix it. And it seems like they're certainly going in that direction, but there's still things about Sony that I don't know why they're doing what they're doing right now. But I believe, you know, the PlayStation division is really strong for them, and this is Let's Talk PlayStation, not Let's Talk Sony. So, for the most part, they're not going away in 2 years. Obviously, they're not going away in 2 years. They got plenty of money. It's not like they owe this liability immediately, and it's not like, you know, companies, especially companies as large as Sony, don't crumble in 2 years. It takes a very long time for them to be in a very dire situation before they're finally done and over with. And like I said, they're turning profit now, so they're certainly going in the right direction. It's just a matter of hoping they make the right choices in the next 10 years. That concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'll finally have a review for Tearaway and Knack this week. Finally. And hopefully more videos will be coming soon. Thank you all for watching. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you so much for talking with me. I'll see you next Friday.